There are a lot of special cars in this world. Some are technological monsters, some are performance kings on and off-road. And we hold these vehicles in our minds on pedestals as being very special, very cool. And while we like these vehicles for a lot of different reasons, it's important to remember that not all models are made alike. There are certain engines, certain trims, certain powertrains, certain transmissions that take a really cool car and make it surprisingly terrible. And in this video, we are going over the top 10 really bad versions of really cool cars.
Do you guys love cars? Well, we've got a new podcast that will keep you entertained for hours, from on-road to off-road, from Corvette to Jeeps. Check out tflcar.com/podcast or go to wherever you get your podcast, including iTunes, Google Podcast, or Spotify.
Number 10 on our list, believe it or not, is a Ferrari, a brand we associate with style, with performance. And the model we are talking about is based on the 308, a car made famous by Thomas Magnum cruising around Oahu in Magnum PI, or Christy Brinkley making Chevy Chase's jaw drop in National Lampoon's Vacation. The 308 was an amazing car. It looked great. It was fast for its era. Just one of the best Ferraris of all time, in my opinion. However, there was a version of the 308 that was not very good, and that's the Ferrari 208. You see, it had the same style and the same excitement in design as the 308, but the engine left a lot to be desired. Now, the 208 came out in 1980 as a way to combat huge value-added taxes in Italy. So cars over Italy back in the early 80s had taxes of upwards of 38%. But only cars with displacements more than 2 liters, which of course the V8 and the 308 was. So Ferrari's solution was to debore the 308 and make a car called the 208. Now, the early 208s were not very popular sellers, and it's understandable why. You paid Ferrari prices, but you got just 153 horsepower. That's right, there was a stylish Magnum PI like Ferrari with less horsepower than a base model brand new Camry of today. 50 less horsepower to be exact. Now, Ferrari sold just 300 208s between 1980 and 1981, and then they actually added a turbo to the car, which made it a little bit more exciting. But early 208s were very, very slow. One of the slowest Ferraris of all time. They had one of the smallest displacement V8s of all time. They left a lot to be desired. In fact, one of my dad's friends in Europe had a Ferrari. He flew over, he was like, let's see this Ferrari, I'm excited to drive it. He got in the seat and said it was one of the slowest cars he's ever driven. He asked his friend, what is wrong with your car? And he said, oh, it's a 208, just 153 horsepower. Number 9 on our list is another icon, but this time an American icon, the Jeep, the Wrangler. Now, the original Jeep came out way back in 1941 on the battlefields of World War II, and when it returned home to the US, it quickly became an American hero, an American icon. A Jeep CJ was something that you would take into the wilderness. A Jeep Wrangler is a vehicle you would go adventuring with. They were 4-wheel drive, they were tough, they were rugged. But believe it or not all of these iconic vehicles are actually all that good off-road, because nowadays when you think Wrangler, you think, let's go off-roading. But believe it or not, there was a Wrangler sold between 2007 and 2010 that was not worthy of off-roading really at all, because the JK Wrangler actually debuted in both 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive form. I know this is kind of hard to believe, but I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. In fact, a while back, I was at a dealership, a somewhat sleazy dealership just outside of our hometown here in Colorado, looking at a Wrangler, a 4-door unlimited Wrangler, and it was a good price. Suspiciously good, because this dealer has kind of a reputation of overcharging. You know, it was in good condition, pretty low mileage, but it was a couple grand lower than market value. And it's not until I went to grab the 4-wheel drive lever did I realize what I was dealing with and why it was so cheap. I was looking at a 2-wheel drive Wrangler. They are pretty rare, unlimited only, sold for just 3 years. But in fact, you could buy the good old American hero with just 2-wheel drive. That's pretty crazy. Number 8 on our list conjures up images of majestic horses prancing, darting across the landscape and the countryside. I am, of course, talking about the Mustang. Coming out in mid-1964, the Mustang was a huge success right off the bat. And if we're being honest, it was a huge performance success as well, with V8s ranging from 289 all the way up to huge big blocks over 400 cubic inches. And then in 1974, Ford completely redesigned the Icon to make the Mustang II. Now granted, the Mustang II is not the most liked vehicle, but you could still get it with the 302 V8 in King Cobra form. That's right, there was a model called the King Cobra II. They were still pretty sporty. However, not all Mustangs of this era are built alike. In fact, there was a model called the Mustang II MPG. And of course, the world in the early 1970s had undergone the fuel crisis, which meant fuel efficiency was at the top of everybody's mind. So Ford responded with a new model that should be fuel efficient, but also sporty and exciting. But in reality, it had more to do with an arthritic donkey than a majestic horse. I'm talking about the Ford Mustang MPG. That's right, it was a 4-cylinder 2.3-liter Mustang that had no sporty aspirations whatsoever. Now, it came out in the mid-1970s with a catalytic converter, a 318 rear axle ratio. A standard Mustang would have had a 340. Naturally, the MPG had to be much worse. And a claimed EPA rating of 23 mpg. Nowadays, with modern tech, we can get over 20 mpg on the highway in a 707 horsepower V8 muscle car. But back in the 1970s, if you wanted 20 mpg, you needed a 4-cylinder, and more specifically, a Lima engine 4-cylinder. That's what the name of the 4-cylinder was. And I couldn't find an exact horsepower, but I did find some ratings on the standard 2.3-liter Lima 4-cylinder. Any guesses? Nope, you're wrong. 89 horsepower and 118 pound-feet of torque. Combine this with questionable looks, terrible build quality, and the Ford Mustang II MPG was not only slow, really not all that efficient, terrible to look at, and surprisingly horrific to drive. Number 7 on our list of really terrible versions of really cool cars is, believe it or not, a Tesla. I know, I said it, a Tesla, and more specifically the Model S, a car that nowadays can accelerate 0 to 60 in just 2.4 seconds. It's a technological marvel. They've got incredible range, and frankly, the Model S you can go out and buy right now in 2020 isn't all that different from when the Model S debuted in 2012, 2013. So, the old ones you're probably thinking are probably just as cool as the new ones, and in a lot of ways, they were. The one you're probably thinking of back in 2013 had a range of 265 miles, could accelerate from 0 to 60 in just 4.4 seconds. Even back in 2013, 2012, they were really cool cars. However, not all Model S's of that era are all that cool, if I'm being honest, because Tesla came out and said in 2009, we're going to have a relatively affordable Model S, under $50,000. They promised a starting price of $49,900. Nowadays, when you think affordable Tesla, you think Model 3. However, this was several years before the Model 3. So Elon was promising a Tesla for under 50 grand, and here's how they did it. The very short-lived and relatively hated Tesla Model S 40 kilowatt hour. Kilowatt hours refer to the capacity of the battery pack, and most Teslas of this era would have had an 85 kilowatt hour or maybe a 60 kilowatt hour battery, but not the 40. You see, in order to get the price point under 50, Tesla basically decontented a mid-range Model S to create the 40 kilowatt hour. You're probably thinking, oh, okay, somewhere in the range of 250 miles maybe? No. The EPA rated the 40 kilowatt hour with a range of just 139 miles. It had a top speed of just 110 miles per hour, and while it was still pretty quick to 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds, the 40 kilowatt hour was heavily decontented over the ones that you would come to know. No backup camera, no navigation, and no supercharging. They didn't sell many 40 kilowatt hour cars at all. In fact, it was discontinued in just under a year. Tesla saying only 4% of customers chose that small battery pack, and frankly, all Tesla did was take a mid-sized battery pack and software limit it. So for $10,000, you could upgrade your 40 kilowatt hour to a 60 kilowatt hour if you so desire. So, think your Model 3 was the first affordable Tesla? It wasn't. It was in fact the Tesla Model S 40. Short-lived and really with 139 miles of range, not all that useful. Number 6 on our list is a BMW, more specifically a variant of a 3 Series, a car that today is brilliantly fun to drive, and even back in the 1990s, the 3 Series was great. Known as the E36 in the 90s, the 3 Series was somewhat affordable, it was quick, it looked good, well optioned, and most importantly, brilliant to drive, the ultimate driving machine. However, there was a version that here in the US wasn't so good whatsoever because BMW wanted an even more affordable version of their 3 Series, so they debuted the 3 Series Hatchback, an entry-level BMW that was more affordable than the 3 Series. However, it wasn't affordable enough, and it certainly got hit by the ugly stick. The hatchback looks like a rock fell on the back of a 3 Series, and someone just was like, okay, we'll just amputate the front of it and call it a day. Here in the US, we only got the 4-cylinder, the 318 Ti, which meant it wasn't all that quick, and in terms of handling, it used a much worse suspension, rear suspension, than the standard 3 Series, which meant that journalists of the time said it was not that great to drive and handled very poorly, resulting in tremendous amounts of oversteer at the limit. So, wasn't all that much cheaper than the 3 Series of the era, certainly wasn't very quick, wasn't very good to look at, and would spin out around corners when you weren't expecting it. The 3 Series hatchback was a big failure here in the US. It only sold for a few years and it was quickly canned. Now abroad, they actually built an E46 version of the 3 Series hatchback as well that people did like, but here in the US, it was a non-starter. I think part of that is because when you hear the word BMW here in the US, you expect a lot of luxury, a lot of performance, whereas abroad, you might be used to cloth seats and only one mirror in your BMW. That was not the case here in the US at all. People expected a lot of luxury, a lot of performance, and the 3 Series hatchback just didn't deliver. Number 5 on our list is actually a Mini, and it was the first generation of Mini to return here to the US called the R50. If you remember back in the early 2000s when BMW owned Mini, they launched an all-new model of the Cooper, and it actually was brilliant. It was a really great packaged car, fun to drive. If you got the Cooper S, it was fast, it looked great, the interiors were surprisingly stylish, and all around a winner of a car, except if you got the automatic equipped Mini. Now modern day automatics are fast, they're almost as fun as their manual counterparts, and in a lot of cases will perform better. However, in the early 2000s, BMW for some reason decided to equip the new Mini with a CVT. Now CVTs are synonymous with being, affordable, but also miserable to drive with high revving, drony engines that really just don't deliver a lot of performance, something that you don't associate with a fun to drive Cooper. And in fact, the first generation Mini Cooper CVT wasn't only not very fun to drive, it also had a horrific reputation for reliability. The early CVTs in what's known as the R50 Minis had a failure rate of close to 100%. They failed so often and so quickly that a class action lawsuit forced Mini to warranty the CVT for 8 years or 150,000 miles, which was great 12 years ago, but now they are all out of warranty. The first generation Cooper is a great platform, fun to drive, fun to modify, but the CVT ones were just terrible. Number 4 on our list is one of my very favorite cars of all time, actually trucks really, the Land Rover Discovery, old school, body on frame. They looked great, they were comfortable, amazing off-road, surprisingly durable. However, there was one version of the Discovery sold in the UK which wasn't so good, and that was the MPI. This was a 4-cylinder gasoline-powered Discovery. Now modern day 4-cylinders are turbocharged. To make a lot of low-end torque, you can put a small turbo 4-cylinder into a fairly large vehicle and still have it perform well. Well, back in the early 90s, when you put a small 4-cylinder into a Discovery, it didn't have a turbo, it was only 2 liters, and it made just 134 horsepower and 137 pound-feet of torque. Now keep in mind the Discovery is no small vehicle, weighing in at well over 4,200 pounds, which meant that this old school solid axle SUV accelerated from 0 to 60 in a remarkably disappointing rate of 15.3 seconds. Now, of course, they did have small displacement turbocharged diesel engines, and diesel engines are great in the Discovery because they make a lot of torque. However, naturally aspirated 4-cylinders of the early 90s did not make a lot of torque, which meant that hauling around your family and your friends, maybe a caravan, the 4-cylinder Discovery gasoline engine was just miserable. Number 3 on our list comes from a manufacturer that typically makes some of the best driving cars on the planet. And in fact, this really isn't an exception in a lot of ways. I'm of course talking about the Porsche 912. Now, when Porsche discontinued the 365 in the mid-1960s and debuted the 911, there were huge leaps and bounds in technology and performance that the 911 offered over the 365, but it also offered huge jumps and leaps in pricing as well. Of course, the 911 had that legendary flat 6, whereas the 365 had a flat 4-cylinder, an engine that had a lot in common with the Volkswagen Beetle. So, to bridge the gap between the old outgoing 365 and the new expensive 911, Porsche came out with a model called the 912. Now, the 912 had the same body as the new 911. It had the same architecture as the new 911. It looked great, it handled great, but it only had a 102 horsepower flat 4-cylinder engine. An engine that has a lot in common with the old school clattery Beetle. That's right, they had a Porsche you could buy with a Beetle engine. Now, they were very fun to drive. They handled much better in some cases than the 911s because they had a lot less weight over the rear axle. However, with 102 horsepower, they cost almost twice as much as a same-year Ford Mustang with a base straight 6. And a base Mustang with a 200 cubic inch straight 6 actually made 120 horsepower. So it made more power, it cost half as much, which meant in the real world, it would hit 0 to 60 much quicker than the first generation 912. Now, the 912 was killed off in 1969, and new, more affordable Porsches were launched, like the 914. However, if you recall, there was a little bit of a gap between when the 914 stopped production and the 924 started production, the next generation of entry-level Porsche. So Porsche's solution during that 1 year was to fill the gap with another 912, this time called the 912e. It was a US-only car, and it had, well, frankly, not much more power than the first generation. The little 4-cylinder in the 912 has a lot in common with something like a Volkswagen bus. Still air-cooled, and tests of the era found that it would hit 0 to 60 in 11.3 seconds. Definitely not what we would call quick by modern standards, or even standards in 1976, 115 miles an hour top speed. However, they did claim it was very fuel efficient, with some people claiming a range of over 600 miles per tank on the lowly 912. So there you have it, a car that looks like a 911, handles in some cases way better than a 911, but not powered by anything remotely to performance car territory. Number 2 on our list is a legendary BMW, the 7 Series, more specifically a 7 Series that was discontinued maybe a year ago. I'm talking about the 740 eDrive. Now, the 7 Series is well deserving of its iconic status. It's the ultimate in comfort for the BMW lineup. They are huge, they are beautiful, they are well designed, but the 740 eDrive wasn't really that great. And let me explain what I'm talking about. Now, it was a plug-in hybrid, and the idea with a plug-in hybrid is you combine the best attributes of electricity and gasoline engines into one vehicle that's efficient, fast, and all around worth the extra cost. Now, the 740 eDrive had a battery that was just far too small for all electric use, and a gasoline engine that was far too small for performance or any kind of motivation down the road. So on electric, the vehicle could travel just 14 miles before the gasoline engine would have to kick on, and the gasoline engine was way too small. Total system output with the gasoline engine and the electric motor running, 322 horsepower. But when the battery died, you'd have to rely solely on the gasoline engine, which was just a wee little 2-liter for a massive 7 Series. And that 255 horsepower gasoline engine, according to journalists I've talked to, was just far too underpowered for the platform. So you had 14 miles of decent performance and decent efficiency, but when that died, you were left with just a tiny 2-liter lugging around this huge car that would average just 27 mpg. Now, a standard 2-liter 7 Series is going to be pretty slow on its own, but when you add that 2-liter lug around extra batteries that are really not contributing much to the overall powertrain, it just gets too slow. The new version, the 745 eDrive, is a little bit better because they've gone to a straight 6 engine, which is much more powerful and a slightly larger battery. But the first attempt wasn't so good. And the number 1 car on our list is unfortunately representative of many cars of the late 1970s here in the US. I'm talking about the C3 Corvette. Now the C3 Corvette is, in my opinion, the best looking Corvette of all time. That classic Coke bottle shape. And when it came out in 1967 through the early 70s, the car had a lot of power. In some cases, big block V8s would make over 400 horsepower, up to 460 horsepower of advertised power with a 7.4 liter V8. These were proper muscle cars, proper sports cars. They looked great and they went like stink. However, by 1981, you could still buy a C3 Corvette. However, due to emissions and fuel economy crises that had come and gone, the only engine was a 350 small block V8 that made just 190 horsepower, taking a legend, the C3 Corvette, one of the best designs of all time, and completely neutering it to a car that could barely out-accelerate your tiny compact of today. With 190 horsepower, the car really wasn't a sports car at all. It still looked brilliant, but by 1981, it was so choked, it was just about useless. Not saying I wouldn't buy one, because I think the design is so good and they're getting affordable now, but if you want to go fast, a late 70s or early 80s Corvette is not going to be the car for you. Well guys, thank you so much for watching. Now keep in mind that even though these examples may not be the best of their models, a lot of the cases I still think they're very cool, still an interesting piece of history, a car I still may want to buy sometime in the future. For example, my favorite on this list has to be the Tesla Model S 40 kilowatt hour, because you know they sold so few of those. One of these days those are going to be valuable. Head over to tflcar.com for the latest and greatest in new car reviews, and stay tuned to TFL Classics for everything related to old and used cars.